This session today is for the students who are enrolled in the PGJMC all across the India. As we all know that the media as the fourth pillar of democracy. But this pillar, sometimes what it does, it shakes very base of the society. So let's find out what role does media play in relation to the national security and the sensitive issues. To talk about this, we have in studio with us Mr. Sanjay Mattu, who is associated with the AIR as in the panel of news readers on AIR, and he's also the visiting faculty in Kamala Nehru College. He will enlighten our viewers about how and why the media acts and reacts on highly sensitive issues and the crucial issues concerning India and the security in India. Welcome, sir. You've been working with the media industry and the AIR. The first question that I would like to put across you is, do you think that there is a difference in the portrayal of the media content or the events that are actually covered in the different medias?
Well, Madhvi, that's an interesting question. Obviously, when we are talking about the different media, I presume we are looking at print, we are looking at television. Mm-hmm. There is radio, of course, but in India, radio is state-controlled. We don't have any independent or autonomous or even private radio channels. So if we basically focus on print and mm-hmm. television, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is that the very nature of the medium itself in some ways determines the kind of media output that we see. Now, what do I mean by that? अगर हम देखें television पे time is of the essence. हर चीज, हर story 1 minute में या 1.5 minute में उनको wrap up करनी पड़ती है. There's not much time. Whereas in print, the advantage is that you can have a long article, you can even have short articles, but there is space to flesh out the story. So what impact does it have? This means कि in the print media, often what you see are largely analytical stories as well. Of course, there'd be reportage, but even the reportage can afford to be analytical because there is space to flesh out facts, to analyze, to interpret. In television, we don't have that luxury. There's only a minute or, a minute and a half. 90 seconds, whatever it is. So that means that the media output on television news becomes brief, and then it becomes a question of, so if I only have 90 seconds to put the story, what are the facts I take? Do I put in any analysis or interpretation? Typically there is not much time for analytical. So in that sense, television news stories are more perhaps factual, high on maybe facts, less on analysis and interpretation, and even within those facts, because you only have time for certain facts, a kind of editorial decision comes into play. Should I take this fact or should I take that fact? So that's one thing. In television, even the viewing practice, for instance, television you are viewing along with doing 10 other things, right? So television does not have a captive audience. Television has to make an attempt to grab your attention. So for instance, catchy headlines become very important. The language of the news becomes very important because they know that I have to grab hold of the audience and make him sit in front of the television. While reading the paper, typically if you look at the habit of reading a paper, it's a very focused activity. When we sit down to read the paper, we are clear that we are going to read the paper and not get distracted by 10 other things. So the papers can afford to be less dramatic, less, less, let's say, theatrical in their headlines. Though now even in the newspapers, you see, if you look at the different papers, even some of the headlines are very, very dramatic.
They're catchy. Somewhat today, these days, it's catchy.
They're catchy, absolutely.
Right.
Unless you look at a newspaper like the Hindu, which still focuses largely on very factual headlines.
Right.
It doesn't editorialize a headline. But yes, you're right. Most papers are, kind of come up with catchy headlines. That's the other problem that we have, or that's the other way in which they're different.
Okay, so when we talk about the different media, you're talking about that. But the thing is, you're talking about the content which is there in the newspaper. It's very descriptive. So can we say that it's more of qualitative in terms of getting the information, or can we say that the television content is not qualitative?
It's difficult to reach a definite judgment on that. But yes, what one can say is that newspaper reportage can be more analytical and perhaps more informative because there's more space, so they can put in more facts. Right. They can analyze more. Television news is less analytical unless there's a program or a discussion specifically devoted to analyzing a particular news item or an event. It's less analytical and interpretative.
Okay. So since you're talking about India and the issues that are being covered in India, the next question that actually pops up in my mind is like, India is a secular and a democratic country. So why does media try and color a particular event or a situation with a particular kind of an ideology? As we saw what happened in the Godhra riots at that point of time. So what will you say on this?
Well, I think if you look at the coverage of the post-Godhra violence, which happened in Gujarat in 2002, I think.
Right.
I think that's one of the few instances where a section of the media actually, covered it rather well. And what you call giving it an ideological kind of color, I would call a form of interpretation. And if we look at what happened in post-Godhra violence, and see, I use the word violence, I'm not using the words riots, because I think riots connote something else, and what happened on the basis of the information we have from the media, what happened in Gujarat was really not two equal groups fighting among themselves. It was a very organized, a very systematic attack on a particular community by members of another particular community, where the members of the community which was being attacked did not really have much of a chance to retaliate. So it wasn't in that sense a riot. I think it more corresponds to what we understand as, let's say, a genocide. For the scale and the kind of organized and systematized violence that we saw. So I think in that event, it was important and it was necessary that it was understood in this way, because that was the interpretative role. Otherwise, how would we understand that violence? The issue is not just of reporting the violence. Right. I think one of the important functions of the media is to help the viewer or the listener or the reader make sense of what's happening. And how do I, unless there is an interpretation or some analysis of that event, how do I make sense? So should we just say, 2,000 people were killed?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense to me. Obviously in my mind the questions will arise. But why did that happen? How did that happen? When did it happen? Couldn't something have been done about it? What was the state doing while all of this was happening? Now the moment we get into answering those questions, we automatically come up with an interpretation or analysis. So, and of course, any interpretation or analysis requires a particular framework, an ideological framework. And in this case, the ideological framework was looking at it from a secular versus communal framework.
Right.
So I think that was, to me, I think that was important and that needed to be done.
So, but was it right giving it a communal color altogether? The Hindus were against the Muslims and the Muslims were against the Hindus. Was that correct?
Well, in as much as if you look at the events of what happened, I mean, there were these organized gangs, or call them groups of Hindus, well armed, with full information about the victims, and the victims also were targeted of a particular group.
Right.
So if you look at that, you can't help but notice that difference. I mean, like for instance, you take the anti-Sikh riots of 1984.
Right.
exactly the same thing happened. It was organized, it was systematic, it was targeted. It said that these people had lists of the house numbers where each person lived. Right. So when it's happening on this scale, and and also let's not forget what preceded it, and let's not forget what followed it.
Right.
So if you place it before in that context, you cannot but help see it in and I don't think it's giving it a communal color. I think it's interpreting it in a certain way. Of course, I mean, somebody else may not interpret it that way. You're right. I mean, but if that interpretation is missing, very certain important questions go unanswered. Why did this violence happen? Now, how do I answer this question?
Right.
If I have to answer, why did this violence in post-Godhra violence take place? What answer do I give? And the moment I get into answering this question, clearly an ideological framework will come into play.
Okay. Sir, you've been talking about the ideology, but it leads to some sort of exaggeration also at certain point of time. So do you think that there's a tinge of exaggeration while exposing corruption, or maybe a particular event, or maybe a person who has not done good deeds?
Well, you call it exaggeration. Of course, I mean, in literal terms, sure. I mean, I'm sure many, media outlets do that, exaggerate facts, exaggerate information. I would be more keen on looking at it from the point of view of sensationalizing it.
Okay.
Sensationalizing it would mean, giving it a certain kind of a dramatic importance, which that event may have or may not have. So certainly sensationalizing does take place, and what happens in sensationalizing is that your personal views take precedence over facts, and it becomes very difficult for the viewer or the reader to actually arrive at a judgment for himself, where the facts get so clouded and obfuscated, or if there's incorrect reportage. I mean, of course, one hopes that doesn't happen. Then obviously it makes it difficult, or then it pushes the reader or the viewer into making certain kinds of conclusions. So I think sensationalism is happening, and that's so evident in the kind of language that is used. For instance, it strikes me as being funny that now you hardly hear the word object or disagree. It's always tear into. So leader of the opposition, Sushma Swaraj, tore into the finance minister's speech. Now, I don't know what tearing in means. For all you know, she may have just disagreed with certain things that he may have said. So, use of the word thrash, even in sports. I mean, now it's no longer cool to say, team A defeated team B. It's always team A thrashed team B. So, and these are not neutral words. I mean, these are words which, any word that we say, in its cognitive ability, it creates a visual in my mind. Right. And that visual in my mind actually may be very different from how the event may have unfolded in reality. So I think this has struck me that the use of the certain words, the whole tenor and the language that is used in news now does create the sense of, because I think ultimately the media thrives on crisis, and I think this is one way of always keeping people on the edge, as if there's always some crisis or the other, that reality is a series of unfolding crises, and I think that's really a problem.
So you've been talking about language that's being used in the news, maybe whether it be maybe in terms of print or electronic. Basically, what we see these days is catchy language is being used, right? Does that mean that they're trying to involve the people to make it more interactive? They're doing all of it, or is there any other reason behind that?
As I said, to me, it's a part of this larger part of sensationalizing the news. Often it's also a way of 24-hour news, television news demands inputs. Right now, what do you see as news? 24 hours you can't keep getting news fall. So then how do I fill up my air time for 24-hour news, for a 24-hour news channel? So I have to pick up often stories which conventionally would not qualify as news, in the sense. So there's also a kind of a routinization happening where I pick up something a routine event and then I sensationalize it so that, then I can push it as being a part of the oeuvre of news. So I think that also is definitely, I see that happening in my view. I think that's also what 24-hour television news is doing.
Okay, so it means creating a space for the people who are the viewers to get in there and get the information at the same time.
No, but not just get information, to see information in a particular way.
Okay.
It's not just getting information, because I mean, I don't think there's anything neutral about it, but about the whole process. It's about wanting the viewer to see something in a certain way, and wanting if I have a catchy headline even in a paper, for instance, suppose Parliament has been disrupted, right? The Parliament was, let's say, stopped, stalled, and it was prorogued.
Right.
Now I can have a headline saying, a particular party brings the Parliament down to its knees. Or another headline could be Parliament adjourned for the day. Now if I see the headline Party X brings Parliament down to its knees, you see, already an image has been formed in my head, and when I start reading the story, even if the facts may be mentioned of actually what happened, somewhere the way I'll process that information is that, wow, this Party X has so much clout in Parliament that it managed to, it's a very graphic visual, bringing Parliament down to its knees, the highest legislative body in the country being, reduced to a helpless body. So these catchy headlines, I think this is what they do. They in a sense prepare you to read the story in a certain way.
And they're attacking the subjectivity of the viewer, I guess.
Absolutely. It's definitely attacking this subjectivity of the viewer. It's forcing you to look at it in a certain way.
Okay. I mean, there's a particular view that's been actually, taken into consideration while viewing a particular event or maybe a situation. So it means the different aspects that are being portrayed by the media. So is that relevant, or is that essential that a particular event should be portrayed with a particular aspect?
Well, I think in effect what you're asking me is about objectivity.
Right.
Right? That's always a tricky question, and most journalism students are told about objective news, about balanced news. Balanced, I understand. Objective is difficult.
Very
because I think, you see, the word by using the word objective, what we are indicating is that there is a truth out there which can be grasped. So, and then we judge, has this paper or has this news report managed to grasp that truth? However, I think there is no a single truth out there regarding any event or any phenomenon or any, anything that may have happened. There is no one correct truth about that event.
Okay.
All that we see are perceptions. Every news report about a certain event or a certain phenomenon will be a perception about that phenomenon. The issue is marshalling all facts of the case and all interpretative and analytical tools at my disposal. Can I build a more convincing case from my perspective vis-a-vis the case you build for your perspective? So so it's not about aspects, it's about, and we all have our political positions. We all operate within a ideological framework from which we analyze and understand events. So I think the sooner we understand that it's not, objectivity is not possible, because nobody is objective. We all have our own perception. Yeah, of course, facts, certain facts of the case can be objective, but even facts, which fact I choose to include in the story could be an editorial decision. It's not that we include every fact of the case. Even what constitutes a fact worthy of, we may come across 5 pieces of information.
Right.
But do we see all 5 pieces of information as facts which are incorporated in the story? No. I bring to bear a certain understanding and I say, this is an important fact for my story. So at every stage of the production and generation of a news report, I think individual subjectivity is coming into play. So it's not possible really to have a objective, in that sense, an objective story. However, what I do think is you can have a balanced story where different points of view of looking at a particular phenomenon or a particular story are, placed before the reader, so that the reader can then make up his mind, or the viewer can then make up his mind. Yeah.
So, but the thing is, when the news has a subjective point of view of the writer or maybe the anchor or whosoever is making the news, how authentic is it then to believe on that? Should the viewer or the reader believe it blindly? Because the facts are there, but the facts are molded. So should it be taken like this, or what authenticity does the news, that particular news has?
Well, you see, on the question of authenticity, you can have authenticity about facts. You know, either a thing happened or it didn't happen. Either an accident took place or it didn't take place. So if you are telling me that an accident took place when an accident actually didn't take place, and then clearly you are lying. So obviously, you know, and I as a reader perhaps may not have a way of verifying that immediately. Maybe later I might get onto the internet and, you know, do a Google search and see, oh, but there was no accident, you know, there's nothing mentioned on the website. So in that case, of course, I know that the news channel is lying. So we presume that, you know, certain facts would be authentic. I don't think the issue is so much of doubting the facts. It's of, do I find the analysis of those facts plausible? You know, that's the issue for me, that what sense do I make of these facts? Unless somebody is, you know, really choosing to put out wrong facts, which often happens, you know, which is also true. You know, the media is known to do that. And, you know, for instance, it's also very interesting, since you bring up this issue of authenticity, this becomes very important in, let's say, stories which are quoting sources, you know, which are not which are not openly spoken about. So, for instance, an intelligence story, right? And if you look at the coverage of, let's say, conflict areas like Kashmir, for instance, right? Now, if you remember when the stone throwing protests were happening in 2010, in the summer of 2010 in the Kashmir Valley, a lot of the papers and a lot of the channels brought out a news report which said that the intelligence agencies had intercepted a conversation between a Hurriyat conference leader and one of the stone throwers, and, you know, talking about funding them and, you know, organizing it. And, you know, so clearly, immediately that was picked up by all the media and reported, and, you know, it was analyzed, it was interpreted to mean, see, these are not spontaneous protests, these are not popular, these are planned, these are organized, maybe the inspiration is coming from, you know, Pakistan. So, but interestingly, after that there was a YouTube video which had come out, which showed two people in army fatigues carrying the body of a supposedly a terrorist who was strung onto a bamboo pole with his hands and legs tied. Now, clearly this was, you know, critical. I mean, this could damage the reputation of the army. No sooner had that video come than the media was abuzz with, you know, doubts about the authenticity. So now that's also interesting, how we receive intelligence inputs as being authentic. You know, nobody doubted, nobody asked. So how can we verify whether actually, you know, that phone conversation had happened? Nobody heard it. I mean, none of us heard that conversation. But when it comes to, you know, transgressions, alleged transgressions by the state or the state's agencies, immediately, you know, this whole question of authenticity comes in. So I think these are things we need to reflect on, and, you know, we need to think about these things.
So you've been talking about the perspective or maybe the authenticity that includes the minds of the people who are actually viewing it, at the same time who are actually producing it. But I have a different perspective towards this, and from the perspective of a general audience or maybe as a viewer, I want to find out, is the subaltern perspective of a particular victim who's gone through a lot of pain or so much of I can't even describe that. It's hell lot of pain. So how do we explain that? Is the subaltern perspective portrayed, or is it shown really in terms of the media?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Madhvi, because, and you know, frankly, one of the most severe criticisms of the way the media covered the Mumbai attacks was that there were different, as we all know, that there were different sites which were attacked. So you had the Taj Hotel, and you also had the Chhatrapati Shivaji terminus. And I think that's been a uniform criticism of the media, that there was so much of coverage of the Taj attacks. In fact, all the cameras were placed right there.
Right.
We never got to see anything about, other than the CCTV footage at the Chhatrapati Shivaji rail terminus. We didn't see any footage. Now I think that highlights the kind of bias that exists in the media, and precisely what you were saying about the subaltern perspective, because the Chhatrapati Shivaji terminus is used largely by common people, working class people getting onto the suburban trains, commuting. We didn't see much coverage of that, but the whole focus was on Taj. So that's the first point, that yes, often the subaltern perspective is not really kind of highlighted, as we just discussed. What worries me more is that often where it is discussed also, there is a kind of a bias in that as well. And let me illustrate to you. I remember after the Mumbai train blasts some years back,
1993 train blasts happened, and then again 2008.
2008. I'm referring to the 2008 train blast. After that, one of India's leading English language newspapers did a profile on the victims of the train blasts and their families every day on the front page bottom. Right? It went on almost through the year, if I remember correctly. Which is fine. No quarrel with that, and I think that's nice. We get to know about what the family has gone through, and precisely what you talked about, the subaltern perspective. What does the pain mean to me? What does loss, despair, pain, for the person who's undergone that experience? But what's interesting is, and when I say it's selective, it's interesting that, for instance, we never get to hear or read about, stories about, let's say, there's a whole group of mothers in Kashmir who've lost their sons. Their sons have just disappeared, and the allegation is that state agencies have taken them away. Now, but we haven't got to hear their voices. We don't hear what is it for a mother to just have a son disappear.
Right.
So I would say, yes, I mean, there is, every time there's talk of, let's say, hanging Afzal Guru.
Right.
What comes into play is, let's talk to the family of the watch and ward staff of Parliament, who's, there was these men who died in the shootout. But, which is fine. Again, I don't have a problem with that. But the issue is that, we don't equally look at, let's say, the families of, people. Did we hear about this boy Tufail Mattu who was killed, and which led to the whole summer protests of 2010. I mean, we don't hear about, anything about his family. So, this kind of discrepancy is worrying. And also, I think somewhere we need to tread the line between, as you say, bringing out the subaltern perspective and personalizing a tragedy. Because you see, when you start personalizing a tragedy or a certain event, it becomes difficult then to have a rational discussion around it. Because if a person starts crying, or in a television studio, or of course there's grief. How do I react to that grief? Of course I'll be empathetic to that grief, but often the danger is that grief then becomes the primary factor, and an analysis, subjective analysis or a rational analysis of that event becomes very difficult.
Okay. So rationalizing is a very different thing altogether, but you talked about empathizing with the victim or maybe the family members. Does the media actually empathizes or sympathizes with the victims, or maybe the people who have gone through the grief and the pain? What does it do exactly?
That's a tough one. I mean, I frankly don't know. If at all they choose to engage, I think they do empathize at times. I mean, there is empathy. But also, sometimes the media can also cynically use it to their, to buttress a particular stand they are taking. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I would kind of find it difficult to generalize on that.
That is what I wanted to find out, whether it sympathizes or empathizes, because sometimes what they do is they do use the emotions and they fool around with the emotions and they show it, they portray it, and then gain TRP or whatever.
No, you're right. Of course, a grieving face, or a face with a teardrop at the end of the eye is always catchy. But the problem is that as I said, it kind of completely closes the door for any rational discussion around that, which doesn't mean that you can't show grief. Of course you can show grief, but the point is we need to know how to handle that grief in a kind of a dispassionate discussion about a particular news item or a particular event that may have happened.
So we were talking about the feelings, the thoughts and the emotions that are kept inside a particular, maybe a mother in Kashmir. So does that give a platform to the person who's the victim, or maybe who's the victim's parent, or maybe somebody who's in relation with the victim? So how would you say that, whether are the emotions unveiled of those people who were the sufferers?
Well, if you don't talk to them, if you don't ask them, if you don't approach them, if you don't feel the need to interact with them or engage with them, I would imagine that they'd end up feeling, kind of nobody cares for us. More importantly, it's not important for the rest of society because, we haven't been asked about it. So, just to give you an example, not that it's comparable in terms of emotion, but, when we saw the summer protests of 2010 in the Kashmir Valley, I don't remember seeing any interview with, there may have been the odd interview, but I personally don't remember seeing any with any stone thrower to get a sense of what is it that they are asking for. Why are they resorting to this step? What does it mean to them? And these are young boys. What would propel an 18-year-old boy to start throwing stones and, be a part of a demonstration? I would like to know that, because that is important for my sense of complete understanding of a certain reality. If I don't get to hear that, all I get to see is, these young children throwing stones at the police or the army contingents. And if that's the other interesting thing, if you notice the visual coverage of those protests, all the coverage was from the point of view of the security forces, because you always had the policeman or the army person foregrounded, and the demonstrators are out there, in the background. So what that creates is that the army or the state apparatus becomes the framing, or rather the frame within which I'm processing a reality. So it always becomes they are the troublemakers. We are the ones who are trying to restore order. Now the question is, what stops media persons from having clicked at least some of the footage from the other side? I think one obvious answer you'd get is a sense of security, that we wouldn't feel secure if we were with them, right? But that in itself tells us something, that if you are feeling more secure with the army than with the people who are protesting, I think that tells us about a certain reality and the way the media is positioning itself within a divisive reality.
Okay. So the next question that actually comes in my mind is, you've been talking about the authenticity and the delivery of the news that's being there in terms of whether it be print or electronic media, but it's been delivering the minutest of details, minutest details, like it happened in the Taj attacks in 2008 in Mumbai. So is it good enough that all the details should be portrayed and should be told on television?
Okay, that's a very important point you've raised, because the larger point there is that where do we balance the need for information in a society with security concerns? Because clearly, I think what you're referring to is has been criticized by some quarters for having, for instance, in describing what happened or what was unraveling during the attack. For instance, I was reading somewhere that in one of the hotels, one of the staff had taken some of the guests into this some chamber in the basement, which was guarded by the army. And apparently some politician said in an interview that, we've just heard that there's this group of people who are safe in that chamber because it's being guarded by the army. Now clearly that was giving away the location of some of those innocent civilians who could have been attacked. So yes, that raises disturbing questions about visual practice. So I think that's something we as a society also then need to think about, that our appetite for information and our desire for knowing everything, that how do we balance that? And sure, there has to be transparency, and sure, anything that affects my life I should know. I mean, I agree with that, but somewhere I think we have to think about how do we maintain a balance between our information needs and the security concerns, not just of the state but of society as a whole.
Okay, so we are talking about the society in general now, that the society is responsible to a certain extent. So is the news, who are the producers of the news. But the question that comes up is, news shows a lot of things that it shouldn't actually show. Like if I remember, during the Godhra riots, there was a Muslim man who was pleading in order to save his family. So how correct was that, clicking somebody's picture, and then that man was troubled a lot by the media organizations and by the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the other people. So how relevant was it? How good was it?
Well, this is always a tricky question, that these kind of visual representations, photographs, or which appear, and you're right, you're talking about Ansari, Qutbuddin Ansari, whose picture with the folded hands was it's very difficult to have a concrete answer about this, because at one level you are right that he was hounded. He became the face of the
the Muslim community,
oppressed
basically.
Muslim community. Now, I could look at it in two ways. The issue is how, in what way is that photograph being used? Because I could argue that, in a sense, that was a very, it highlighted the complete sense of disempowerment that the community felt. So I could say that, this is a good picture which illustrates that, for instance, it's wrong to use the word riots for what happened, because here's a community which is completely disempowered. They didn't, they were in no position to retaliate or to, counter-attack or to even, in that sense, defend themselves. All they could do to defend themselves was to run away or otherwise, get killed.
Or protect themselves.
So I think, so in that context, if I wanted to highlight how helpless and desperate this community was, that's a great picture. Equally, I could use that picture to say, this community doesn't do anything for themselves. They don't help themselves, and we have to, start. You can't keep depending on the state for, help and protection. You have to do something, and you have to. So it's difficult. It's a question of how that picture is used, and with what intention is that picture used. Though the picture innately also has some meaning, which can be, of course, read differently in different ways. So no, I think, no picture innately actually has a meaning, but yes, it can be read differently by different people.
So since we are running short of time, one question that comes up is like, the media follow certain ethics. And the ethics are created by themselves only. So what ethics are there, they have laid for themselves?
Well, that's a very topical concern, and especially with the Supreme Court framing guidelines for media practices, or in the process of, and that's a very debatable issue. There are certain ethics. For instance, they say during, let's say, communal riots, you're not supposed to name the community. In matters of rape, you're not supposed to disclose the identity of the rape's survivor. But we see that these are being flagrantly violated quite often. So, these are, and of course, the whole debate is, should somebody else set the guidelines for the media, or should the media themselves set? They have, I think, that Broadcasting Authority, News Broadcasters Association there. So, that's a kind of tricky issue.
Okay, so it means the media has to follow certain practices, and that is what we were talking about, that is interrogating the different practices that the media actually follows. So thank you so much for being with us, sir, and I hope the viewers, the students who are pursuing PGJMC must be benefited from this, and we'll be back with another session at the teleconference. So till then, keep watching Gyan Darshan.